Hey guys, well, I am so happy to be talking with John Pavlovitz today. He has a new book coming out, which is called If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk, which says it all right there. John, I'm so glad you've joined us.
Oh, it's great to be here. And we travel in such similar circles, but we haven't really gotten a chance to have in-depth conversation very much at all. So I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
Me too, me too. I'm really glad, and I just finished the book. I really enjoyed it. I feel like it just spoke so much to what I think and feel as a Christian. I loved in your introduction, you talked about that meme that's like you had one job, right? Which we've
Right.
all seen that meme of like you had one thing to do. And it's like that is so true in Christianity. We have one job. Like the one thing we're taught is love, be loving. And we are really missing the mark.
Yeah, it's one of those things where when you're in the world of Christianity as a professional Christian, as a minister, as I have been for so long, you're just so in touch with the disconnects that you see, right? And you see out there in the world, like everyone who's watching and listening, they see that disparity between the words of Jesus and the conduct of professed Christians. And so trying to lean into that and ask the question, not just point out the why, not just diagnose it, but say why is that happening, and what is the story that people tell themselves that allow them to live with that sort of dissonance in their lives.
I mean, this is a loaded question, but what is that story that people are telling themselves? And I know it's many stories and many narratives, but what are some of the prevailing narratives that are allowing people to think I can behave like a jerk and it's okay. I've made this okay within my own theology.
Right. I think it comes down ultimately to fear. I think most of the people that we would identify with this sort of toxic Christianity have been raised for sometimes decades with a really punitive God, and a God that they're really terrified of. They'll say that God is loving. And I think fear motivates you to do a lot of things. We act very differently when we're terrified. And you
Mm-hmm.
combine that with a desire to be in community and to not disrupt that community. I think Christians understand really well how fiercely loving the church can be or feel, but how much you become beholden to that. And so I think right now you see a group of people who believe that there is a way that you're supposed to be to stay in that community, and they'll do
Mm-hmm.
anything to not be disconnected from it.
There was a quote in the book that I highlighted that I just loved. And you said, some of this fear that's driving religious people is that they think that God is this microscopic, myopic coward who has appointed them to morally police a world he cannot handle. I loved that quote.
Well, and then you see that all over, but for me, I discovered that really in the issue of sexuality in the church. That was sort of my gateway
Mm-hmm.
issue to deconstruction or demolition, whatever you want to call it, of my faith. And because I would see Christians who would say this God is massive and this God is capable of so much, and yet they could not reconcile the fact that maybe God then did not want to change LGBTQ people. Maybe God created those people exactly as God desired,
Mm-hmm.
and so they believed that God was big enough to change, but only if that person changed to the point where they agreed with them.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
we all do that. We make God in our own image every day, and so that you see that all the time.
I am so fascinated with the kind of theology of fear because I do think it is almost like a self-propelling machine because Christians are very fearful and that does seem to kind of solidify them sometimes, especially politically. But then they seem to sort of grow on this fear. I mean, I think of even there was a preview for one of the new Christian movies. I think it's like God's Not Dead or something. And it was like this horrific scene of, kids being taught about sex in school and the parents getting together and they're like so fearful.
Yeah,
What is it that is attractive to Christians about fear? Because biblically, we're told not to fear. We're told, right? Like,
exactly.
but yet it just feels like fear is this almost grounding, solidifying, attractive force in religion.
Yeah, I think what happens is that Christianity is leveraged with fear to create the need for an adversary. So
Yeah.
I always need someone who's
Okay.
encroaching to do something terrible to keep
Right.
battle posture, because
Mm-hmm.
that battle posture will motivate people, either the fear of God or the
Mm.
fear of immigrants or the fear of hell. And then they can ministers and clergy can really manipulate people to work. And I had a progressive pastor say, when I lost hell, that was really difficult for me because I didn't have a way to get my people activated, which was really really sad. But I think it's true. It's saying there is an enemy approaching, and that stance is what you need to always be involved in.
I'm curious though for you, because I know this is true for myself. I mean, we both come from, more evangelical backgrounds, or I think were you raised Catholic?
I was, and served in the, in mega churches in the South. So kind of inherited that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I find myself even sometimes struggling with, not pushing into fear, right? From the opposite side, like fear of the conservatives or fear of, and not, over focusing on the enemy, the perceived enemy. Like, I think it's a temptation even when you move out of conservatism.
It is. And I think the story that we tell ourselves often as conservatives or more liberal people is that those people are in this restrictive thing that I've outgrown, and I have this wisdom and enlightenment, and there's an arrogance that I think comes with that that's really dangerous. And I tell people all the time, it's really easy for me to manufacture empathy for people who I feel are vulnerable or oppressed people groups, but to look at people from my tribe who look like me and believe the way I used to believe, I find it most difficult to have compassion for them and to want to learn their stories anymore. I feel like I know their story, and so I often dismiss them, and that's really dangerous.
It is. It's a it's a daily temptation for me, I think, just to still have compassion. I think that, and my compassion fatigue, I have to say, for religious groups over the last year it's really waned between watching Christians who say they're pro-life, and you have a chapter that talks about this sort of semi-pro-life thing, but watching Christians who say they're pro-life be so adamantly opposed to mitigating a pandemic.
Yes.
Bizarre. And then watching Christians be so adamantly opposed to talking about racism, or this fight against children being taught about racism in school. But so, I think the pandemic though was just that was a real shocker for me. I'm not going to lie. That was wow, we've really sunk so low that we won't mitigate people dying.
I mean, that's the whole deal. This book, I started writing it in the second weekend of March 2020. It was a different book. It had a different angle. And
I bet.
The same thing. I was looking around and saying, okay, everything that feels oppressive or toxic or angry is coming from mostly white people professing faith in Jesus. And I said, how can that be? And so, as we're always, as I say, fighting with and for our faith tradition. We know the beautiful parts and the life-affirming parts about it, but we see the damage it does. And so it's a really difficult place to live, but especially now, because you have people looking at you going, why would I want to be a part of this thing? It's so exclusionary and so predatory.
Yeah. What does a full pro-life theology look like for you?
Well, I simplify it down, the idea of the phrase pro-life to just being for humanity. And for me, it's trying to understand the ripples of not just our theology as a doctrine, but how it actually permeates people's lives. And so it's always looking at what is the result of my belief, not just what is my intention, but does it expand the diversity around me? Does it lift people so that there's more equity? And if it doesn't, it's really a waste of time, or that's an alarm to me that my theology is actually more precious to me than human beings in my midst. And that's the place that pro-life idea for me really means that I treasure human beings when I come across them, even if I don't agree with them.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting in your book that you talked about, the fixation on abortion. When people talk about pro-life, it's really fixated on abortion. Right. And kind of because the unborn is this almost like simplistic and easy thing to fight for, as opposed to the broader issues of humanity and life that might cost something of us, right?
Right. I talk about it being sort of clean, easy activism. It lets you feel some semblance of self-righteousness, but you really don't have to change your life or look at your privilege or
Mm-hmm.
deal with, the prejudices that you have. And so often when people are, slandering immigrants or they're vilifying LGBTQ people, I'll just kind of remind these people, well, they were once embryos. And
Yeah.
so could you be as fiercely for them
Yeah.
as you were then? And that's a challenge for all of us, right? It's really easy to have someone be an idea, but when it's a
Right.
flesh and blood human being, it's messy.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it is much easier to say, well, I'm pro-life, I'm going to check a voting box, and now I've done my job for humanity, than it is to go like, okay, I think we have some refugees from Afghanistan landing in my neighborhood. Can I clear a bedroom out? Right?
Yeah,
Or
right.
my local foster care, is saying they don't have foster homes. Can I clear a bedroom out? Or,
Right.
things that really actually cost us something.
Yeah, Kristen, I think the other part about it is then you actually have to do some work and process, what do I actually believe, and how are my beliefs seeping into the life that I live, and how other people feel around me, and how I experience difference.
Mm-hmm.
And most people don't want to do that. They want the easy fix and the simple way to feel as though they're doing God's work,
Mm-hmm.
and not really ask, is the fruit of my life actually something redemptive?
Totally. Okay, I want to ask you this because I know that there may be people watching who feel like, these progressive Christians, people like myself, yourself, we still identify as Christian. They might be saying, well, they have just moved their theology. They have just manipulated their theology in order to be, more accepting, and they've moved away from the Bible. And I know for yourself, like you have a very strong background in theology. How does your biblical theology actually inform you, as opposed to you moving away and, right? Like,
Yeah, I remember someone came up to me after a talk a couple of years ago and said, hey, I want you to know, I appreciate you, but your writing, you've got this blind spot because you're saying Jesus and all this stuff, but you don't really talk about hell as Jesus did. And, it feels like you're not really, you're cherry picking. And I said, I probably am. I said, but I'm sure you are. And, we all sift the words of the scriptures to something that sort of ratifies our prejudices and our politics. But for me, I look at the life and the ministry of Jesus, I see empathy at the center. And so everything that I do is filtered through that lens.
mm-hmm.
Am I hearing more people because of my theology? Am I seeing more people? Is there a disparate group of people assembling around me? And if not, then I have to question if it's made of whatever God is made of.
Yeah.
And so that's really the other question for me is always, what would the character of God be? And how can I figure out some way to reflect that? And so the words and teachings of Jesus are always going to be that, because I think you can't manipulate those as easily
Mm-hmm.
as you can the idea of God. I think we see conservative folks who want to be cruel saying, God is this and God is that. But to actually take the gospel, it's really hard to take the Sermon on the Mount and twist it into something that is America first or for white people. And so that's the challenge.
Yeah, you said in your book, your theology is only valid to the degree that your life is loving. And that was convicting for me.
Well, and for me too, doing this work, and you've read my writing, and I'm pretty blunt, and so I'm always trying to figure out the jerkiness is in me as well. This book is not about just saying, hey, look at how they got it wrong. It's about, hey, it's a challenge when you rub up against someone who disagrees with something that you believe strongly in, especially when you see other people being injured by it. I think that for me, compassion has to fuel my activism and my theology. And I can't be, the Matthew chapter 23, Jesus just berates the religious people over and over again, but he's not doing it to injure. I think he's doing it because of his deep love for humanity that is being injured. And that's in me. I have to check that every day. Am I trying to show this person something they haven't seen, or am I trying to put them on blast and make them feel like a jerk? Right?
Yes.
We can do that because we're wordsmiths, and so we say, "Oh, okay, I can cut this person down."
Yeah,
and that's a real seductive thing.
It is. It is. I would ask you this, though, because one of the things that frustrated me, particularly in the last election cycle, is I saw a lot of pastors, when they would talk about politics, they would kind of say, it's really important that we're loving. But what they really meant when they said that was, let's just be quiet. Like, let's just stop talking about this. Let's not critique. And I know, and I know you get this, but I get a lot of blowback for like, why are you constantly criticizing the church? Why are you constantly criticizing Christians?
Yeah.
How do you find that balance between valid criticism, right? And valid call out? Because as you said in your book, which I also loved, this bastardization of Christianity is an inside job. We've done this ourselves. So we have to critique from within the system, right?
Yeah.
In order to change. So how do you find that balance between not being a jerk, but also wanting to do call outs and do criticism that help move things forward?
Yeah, I think the challenge is, I was a local church pastor for about 8 years in this mega church in the South, and I was so deeply loved, and we were doing wonderful ministry, but I knew that I was softening my language, that I had slowly become beholden to that community because I didn't want to get them angry. And the more I began to speak with specificity, the more it rubbed up against what they were comfortable with. And suddenly my boldness was not something they prized, it was something they dreaded, and then grew to hate. And so for me, the challenge is always to say, hey, I want to change this place because I know what it can be. I know what the community should be, and therefore the church that is not yet is the church that I want. And it's not just I want it for me or for someone who's not here. I want it for you too, because that fuller expression of love is actually going to help you. And that's so they're not your adversary. You're trying to make them your ally in some way.
Absolutely. I also always just think it's such a funny criticism when people are like, oh my gosh, you're so critical of the church. Like, have you read the Bible? Like, Jesus was so freaking critical of the church of his time and the religious leaders of his time.
Yeah, and that's what it comes down to for me. I always have to check. A motive is everything, because we're going to put words out. I could write 100 words and it will be received differently by every single person who reads it. And in some ways, that's not my responsibility. My responsibility is to choose my words as carefully as I can and have a pure motive in what I intend. And then I can deal with people talking to me about those words. But I think that's the defining trait for me, or the defining idea. What do I intend to do? What is my motivation every day?
Yeah.
And it's got it. And that's what the prophets did. And that's what Jesus did. It was about, hey, I have this ferocity for humanity that is fueling me.
Yeah. And I mean, the irony too also is that I'm sure, this pushback and the call outs of our faith is really so that we can get our shit together and seem more loving and be answering the call to love, right?
Yeah. And that's, for me, the church is, as an entity, is so, I say it's organized religion is often like organized crime, because it's like you are just loved deeply when you're there. But if you begin to say something that deviates, you're often excluded really harshly. And I think that's that all or nothing. Mm-hmm. For me, it was, I knew that I had to be certain as a pastor. I couldn't express doubt, because if I did, that would be a character flaw or moral failing. Mm-hmm. And so that certainty kept me sort of prisoner. And I think so many people are in that place. And that's a dangerous thing. That's, I think, why we have this MAGA Christianity, because no one has the courage to say, I don't think this is acceptable.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree with you. And I've had that experience. When you start speaking up and speaking out, there are some who will really close ranks around you, right? Like it becomes very, very threatening to some people when you start going, I'm not liking this, or I'm thinking differently about this.
Right, because it triggers the questions that they have that they don't want to address. Because I say, no one has time for an existential crisis, but they're worth having, because you really need to address all this stuff. For me, it was like, the more I looked into the church and what I was complicit in, and the way I benefited from the privilege that I have, well, then you have to start dismantling a lot of stuff, and most people just don't want to go there. So it's much easier to keep up that defense posture of I'm right and I know.
Yeah. And I have tried to be mindful of that, in my own, again, compassion fatigue, but, just that so much of this is coming from a place of fear for people, that, it's coming from their own existential crisis, right? And that feeling of, if I pull at this thread, the whole thing might unravel, which,
Yeah, and it's you don't even have to say, "Hey, this isn't true," or "I believe this isn't true." All you have to do is ask, "I wonder if this is actually true," and that's
Yeah.
enough to make someone feel that defensive about it. And it's because the questions are there. What I found out the more I began speaking out was people were saying, "Thank you," because I wanted permission to ask this question or wrestle with this, and then that you give them the space to do that. I think ministers need to lead that way too.
Yeah.
They need to be, more authentic and say, I got up one day and said, I really don't know if I believe this. So I'm not going to preach it.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you what the struggle is here.
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to talk about something you said in your book. You mentioned this earlier, but you said it is morally impossible to pledge complete allegiance to both Jesus and America simultaneously. Talk to me about that, and why is that problematic?
Well, it's problematic because on an elemental level, if we believe that God is who God is, then God is planetary in scale and beyond. And I think there's a shrinking of God. There's a shrinking of the love of that God if we begin to become America centric. And that's what we've seen is this conflating of God and America, or this merging of the two things. And that's just a place where I think, again, it's reminding people that, hey, you're actually in a place where your God is so boxed in that it cannot allow for anything outside of your nation. And what a sad reality that is.
Yeah.
Because if you believe that God created all human beings in the image of God, well, you should want to welcome that diversity, and you should want to actually travel to it or welcome it in your home. And that, you know that so well, that once we begin to get out of those old stories, we get better stories about people, and those stories change us.
Absolutely. I completely agree. It's funny because I can remember as a very fundamentalist, evangelical, conservative kid. I think I was about 8 years old, and I was saying the pledge in class as we did. We said the Pledge of the Allegiance every morning. And I remember thinking, I think this is blasphemy, which of course this is coming from a very, conservative fear of hell framework. But I remember as an 8-year-old thinking, like, I think this is blasphemous. I think this is an idol, and I'm not going to do this anymore. And I stopped saying the pledge at age 8 on. But I mean, even in retrospect, it's like, I have to laugh at the fear that was driving that. But I still agree with that little 8-year-old girl. Like, why am I pledging to a country? Why would I do that?
Yeah, I've done that in that kind of arena, and just theologically, I can remember just starting to singing a song in church and then thinking, I don't actually believe this, but I'm going to sing along because everyone around me is. So you're like lying in church about the love of God. So how ridiculous is that, right? But I was raised in a Catholic church, Catholic school, and America was, ever present as well. And that's just, it's so sad when you realize, my kids, they see it and they ask about it, and it's almost, they can't fathom what it is about America that's so alluring, as an idea. But I think, again, it comes down to, we have been taught that the bad people are non-American, or the bad people are different, which usually different is, non-white and non-English speaking, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel very blessed to have been able to travel in countries that are predominantly Muslim, because I do think, when Americans start talking about that, it's like, okay, hold on. Like, it's just, and that's a gift that I want to give my kids, right? Like, knowing people from every group, it's so much harder to otherize people when you know them.
It is. And when I went to school in Philadelphia, I lived in, upstate New York, and lived in Center City. And even that was just such an expanding of my world. And what happened was, when I went back home, I just like bulldozed everyone else with my revelation, right? So I became sort of arrogant about the fact that, well, you have not seen the world as I have. And that's the hard part, because you do want to say, hey, I've seen these people, or I've been a part of this life, without being condescending about what they haven't experienced. But that's so true. You get out in the world a little bit, and the idea of America is no longer appealing to you. It's not a thing. You appreciate where you live, but you love God and God's people.
Yeah. And I think, that doesn't have to even happen through travel. I mean, my kids, we intentionally live in an area of our town that is diverse. They go to a school where I think it's maybe 20% white kids. They are, my white children are the minority at their school. Yeah. And so when we start talking about immigrants, it's not a concept that's way out here. These are the kids that they're in school with.
Yeah, and even just driving around we do a lot of work together as a family in the city, and just doing work projects, and you don't even have to teach directly. You just expose your children to the difference, and usually their humanity takes over, and it's you don't need to fight it, you don't need to force that.
I
And
agree.
that's what you see adults who have resisted that for so long. That's why with our mega church, what we started to do is surprise people with service projects. One day they all came in Sunday morning, and we had taken out all the chairs in the sanctuary and had tables set up and did food packing, because we said to them, you hear this message every week. Well, today you're going to be the message. And we brought in other ministries to work with them. And so you spent all morning actually just producing something beautiful alongside people who you would never meet with otherwise. But then that's the best kind of church. So it was really wild to start that.
I love that. Well, I want to end with this question. What is giving you hope right now? What is making you feel hopeful? Because I know there's a lot of shit right now.
Right. There is. And, for me, I go back to a Q&A I was doing at a talk a couple of years ago, and a guy said, John, I have two news feeds in my life. He said, one is the social media and the news. And he said, if I only look at that big and distant news feed, that's all bad news, it's all incendiary, I'm going to grow hopeless. He said, but if there's another news feed and it's on the ground close to me, it's in my community, it's in the, the names and faces of people I know. And so I do that every day. I take an inventory. And then I do it on social media too. I make note of people who are still doing beautiful work, or still outraged at injustice, or tired but still going. And that's because that's the story here. The story is, this is our place in time in the history of the planet, and we're doing the work. And it doesn't always register. It's not always trending, but it's always present.
I love that. That's so good. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me. Where can people find you online?
If you can learn how to spell my name, John Pavlovitz, you can find me anywhere, and there's not a lot of them out there. So, on Twitter, Facebook, all that good stuff.
Well, you are one of my favorite Twitter follows. I think you are just always, you are a person, and I'm sure you get this a lot, where I feel like you're saying what I wanted to say. Like, I'm like, yes.
I hope so. Sometimes I don't know. I shouldn't have said it, but I know that people want to say it.
Yes.
No. I appreciate that. And then really, I thanks so much for the time. This has been awesome to get in touch with you.
Yes. And your book, I will have linked up in the comments. I hope people will go check it out. Thank you so much, John.
My pleasure. Thank you.